Hey guys, Mr. Gucci with your last video. Hopefully this one will be shorter. So I received a question today in class, and I fortunately had some notes ready to go. They said, Mr. Gucci, it seems like a scientific method is pretty reliable, and it gives us pretty reliable results, such as, wearing masks helps prevent the spread of COVID. So then why are there so many people that are arguing that we shouldn't wear masks, that masks are bad, that masks don't help, that masks even hurt? Well, here's the thing, all right? Americans they're not so good at this, and it's not just an American problem, but we have, I think, among Western democracies, Western countries, we have a problem with science. 50% of Americans aren't sure if vaccines cause autism or not. This was a rumor from like 20 years ago that just will not die, regardless of all the scientific evidence that proves that vaccines don't cause autism. 50% of Americans still say they either believe they do or they aren't sure. All right. 40% of Americans don't believe in evolution. Evolution is one of the oldest and best tested theories in all of science. It is the cornerstone of modern biology, but 40% don't believe it. 30% currently believe that COVID deaths are being exaggerated, that much, much fewer people have died from COVID than reported. That is being blown up for political reasons. Some people believe that only 10% of the COVID deaths are real, when in fact, the most up to date science tells us that, in fact, it's probably much higher, that we actually have over 200,000 deaths, well over 200,000 deaths by now. And 20% of Americans believe in some or all of the QAnon conspiracy theory. This is so far outside of science. You can't even call it bad science, okay? This is literally the belief that Democrats around the world are eating babies to harness their life-giving blood energy. It is some kooky stuff, and yet 1 in 5 Americans believe some or all of it. So the question is, why? Why are we so bad at doing good science? All right. So here's some reasons. All right. First of all, people come up with bad hypotheses. Remember what I said in the last video in the notes. If you can't prove a hypothesis wrong, then you can never know if it's actually right. Hypothesis has to be testable. And that means there has to be something that could happen to prove it wrong. And there's a lot of people out there who will continue to shore up bad hypothesis with excuse after excuse after excuse until the whole world is against them. Okay? You could say, hey, you said that masks don't prevent the spread of COVID, but we have all this research here that says that it does. Oh, well, that research is suspect because it was done by the government. And it's like, well, why don't you trust the government? Well, they're the deep state. They're trying to control our minds. Well, here's some research that interviews government employees, and they're just trying to help. Oh, well, the researchers are part of the deep state too. Can't trust them. And all of a sudden, every piece of evidence is suspect. There's nothing you can say to disprove it. They've built a wall of logic around them. Air quotes logic. This is how conspiracy theories like QAnon and 9/11 truthers operate, where eventually the conspiracy gets so big that it encompasses everyone who disagrees with you. And there's no actual way to disprove their theory because anyone who tries to is part of the conspiracy themselves. That's just a bad hypothesis. All right. Bad experiments. Okay. The point of an experiment is to try your hardest to prove a hypothesis wrong. And that's hard for people to understand. They'll start with an idea about how they think the world works, and they will only look at those pieces of evidence. And then, in doing so, they end up ignoring the much, much vaster set of evidence that proves them wrong. Take the moon landing. People will look at video footage of the moon landing and say, well, take a look at that American flag. It appears to be waving back and forth on the moon, but there's no air on the moon. There's no wind. So that must mean that the moon landing was faked. And they say that because they start with the idea that the moon landing was fake and they only look for those pieces of evidence. What they fail to take into account is that because there's no air on the moon, if something starts vibrating or moving back and forth, it'll just keep doing it for a while because there's no air to slow it down. So an astronaut plunges the flag into the ground and bumps into it, and it just wobbles back and forth for minutes because there's no air to slow it down. If all you do is look for evidence that proves you right, you're going to end up ignoring all the evidence that proves you wrong. I posted a video of that, which I'm not going to play here, but I will upload it for your enjoyment. Okay. Lastly, people won't accept conclusions. If you make a prediction using a hypothesis and it ends up being wrong, well, then your hypothesis was not as good as you thought. All right. Either you shouldn't believe in it as much as you did, or you shouldn't believe in it at all. Some people can't do this. It's something that takes some training. A good scientist has to be able to say, I'm going to test my hypothesis. I'm putting my money where my mouth is. And if I am wrong, then so be it. I will change my ideas. And that's just real tough. All right. You got to keep in mind. You got to keep in mind, okay, if your hypothesis is proven wrong, that's kind of a bummer. But also, you no longer believe this wrong thing. And so you're smarter now. So every time you're proven wrong, you got to remind yourself this isn't me being dumb. This is me getting smarter every day. By the way, that YouTube channel, Smarter Every Day, I love it. I recommend it highly. Okay, so why do people really believe in these easily disprovable things? Turns out that it might not have to do with science at all. Okay, psychologically, it feels good to be part of a group, even if that group that you belong to believes some real crazy things. Like a lot of the QAnon people get a real sense of community believing that Democrats eat children. I remember when I was your age, a lot of people formed big conspiracy organizations around the idea that Republicans, specifically George Bush, planned 9/11, despite the fact there was no evidence of that at all. All right. Or, and this is worth noting, some people want to belong to a group that believes that their particular race is superior, that they are better than you for no other reason than they have a different color skin. And despite the evidence to the contrary, despite all the scientific evidence you may put in front of them, you won't convince them. Because the point is not whether they're right or wrong. They just like being part of something, like feeling part of a group. And really, you can't, everyone wants to be a part of a group. So, it's up to each of us to find a group that's responsible, right? Like my wife, she was feeling lonely during the COVID lockdown. All right. So was I. Okay. Like she joined a knitting club. All right. And she did like video chats with them. And I chatted with my family. I just feel bad for people that like maybe feel disconnected during COVID. They look for people to hang out with it, to form a group with. And so they just go on Facebook and join a kooky group that believes all kinds of crazy stuff. Okay. Why do people believe easily disprovable things? If you begin to distrust all authority figures, then you're not going to believe anyone and you're just going to double down on what you already believe or what your friends tell you on Facebook. Now, I'm not telling you you should just believe someone because they're an authority figure. That's a fallacy. But look into why is someone an authority figure, okay? If they're just, an important person because they have the most YouTube subscribers or Twitter followers, then, unless they're talking about Twitter or YouTube, they're probably not an authority. But if someone has been like a medical researcher and doctor for 50 years and won multiple awards, then that's probably an authority figure you can trust because they are an authority due to their experience and hard work. Okay. Lastly, some people believe really easily disprovable things because we have a psychological weakness. We just have trouble accepting that big events must be tiny, must have tiny causes. All right. Like, let me put it this way: 9/11 was pulled off by a dozen and a half poorly trained people with less than $500,000 of funding. All right. They hijacked some planes that they had just trained for a few weeks to fly in Arizona, and they crashed into buildings, killed 3,000 people, and launched us into several wars that we're still paying for 2 decades later. People have trouble believing that it was just a dozen and a half guys with $500,000 budget who pulled that off, literally with just box cutters. And so they come up with big conspiracies that it must have been a super big international conspiracy with thousands of players because they would rather believe that than believe that something big can be caused by something small and almost meaningless. Every time there's a huge tragedy or a huge uh, upheaval in the world, people want to come up with equally grand ideas. They don't want to believe that the reason why the world is entirely shut down right now why I am broadcasting this to you while laying back on my couch in my socks and I haven't hugged my mom in 6 months. They don't want to believe that the reason that's true is because some little virus mutated slightly from a bat and infected someone from China, and now over 1 million people are dead. They have to believe something crazy and huge. Like this is an international conspiracy. It's a bioweapon. 5G cell towers are spreading it. They just can't accept that big things can be caused by little causes. Because if they accept that, then the whole world seems insane and meaningless to them. Okay? And so it's hard to reason someone out of a position using good science if they didn't use reason to get themselves into that position. If they didn't reason themselves into it, you can't reason them out of it. And that's a real tough thing. I got some family that believes some pretty crazy conspiracy theories. And it's tough because it's not something you can convince them out of with logic all the time because there's all these illogical reasons why they believe it. All right. So, anyways, that's pretty much it. I hope that answers some questions as to why people believe kooky, non scientific things. Thank you.